and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I am Rose Lucibello, Manager, Advancement Events. Thank you for joining us today for today's lecture, From the Workplace to the Kitchen, Understanding the Influence of Masculinity on Behavior with Luc Zhu, Associate Professor, Organizational Behavior and Industrial Relations at the Schulich School of Business. I accept the responsibility to acknowledge the land I am on. Because we're not gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation Inuit and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, we would like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Great. Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, great. So sorry, I'm having a technical difficulty. I apologize. I'm having a very technical difficulty. One moment. Okay. My apologies for that. I just had a very brief technical issue. If you would like help with your Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button may be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period following today's presentation. Please note that all your questions and comments are visible to the panelists and staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Luc Zhu. Professor Luc Zhu is an associate professor at the Schulich School of Business, York University. Luc's research focuses on business ethics and diversity and has published in top-tier journals in management and psychology. His research has been highlighted in mainstream media outlets like Harvard Business Review, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. We are pleased you can make the time to join us today. Welcome, Professor Zhu. Great.
Thank you, Rose. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity for me to share my research on masculinity, how masculinity norms shape our behaviors. So just to briefly, a brief introduction about my research. I have two main research lines, as Rose mentioned. The first research line, research stream concerns business ethics, and the second one concerns discrimination, especially the ones that are relevant for the workplace. So what I'll be presenting today is based on two research papers and one sort of practitioner-oriented article that was recently published at the Harvard Business Review, all of which are about how masculine norms shape our behaviors. So the first research I'll be presenting today is about how masculine norms shape our behaviors at work. And the second research we'll be presenting today is about how masculine norms shape our eating preferences, the food we choose to eat. So without further ado, I will get started. I will start by sharing my slide. Okay, so can everyone see my slide? All right.
Yes.
So I'd like to start by clarifying or by defining masculinity, because from my my work, I noticed that people often confuse masculinity with another concept called maleness. So masculinity refers to the qualities and characteristics that are traditionally associated with being a man. So these can be traits such as physical strength, assertiveness, and independence, as well as like other cultural expectations around how men are supposed to behave and what roles they're expected to play in our society. In other words, this is what our society expect males to exhibit. It's it's not that men are have more strength, although you could say that men do have more strength. Many men do have more strength, but that's not the point. The point is this is a concept, or it's a sort of like a expectation from our society for men. So it's often viewed as something that's innate or natural, but that's the misconception. That's something that I want to clarify before I delve into the details of the research that I'll be presenting today. So what is innate or nature is maleness, not masculinity. So maleness or physical sex is present at birth. But in contrast, masculinity is a socially conferred and subject to ongoing social proof. In other words, masculinity is a social construct, and that varies across different cultures. There are cultures that are high masculinity, in which case, masculine values are a lot more highly regarded than feminine values. And it also varies across different historical periods and contexts. That means, what is considered masculine in one context may not be the same in another. What I want to note here is that masculinity is not inherently good or bad. It's simply a set of traits and expectations that have been historically associated with men. However, there are some negative consequences associated with what we call toxic masculinity, which involves rigid adherence to traditional gender roles and harmful behaviors such as aggression and sexism. So with that, with the definition of masculinity clarified, I'd like to show our audience today a few stats about what we know about masculinity. Okay, so let's first take a look at what people think of masculinity. This is the result from a 2017 survey from a Pew Research Center. And in this survey, they found that about half of Americans, 53%, say most people in our society these days look up to men who are manly or masculine. So it's a little tricky here. So it's not that most people say that, our society look up to men who are manly or masculine. It's half of the people think that most people in our society look up to men who are manly or masculine. And about 2/3 of these who say that our society look up to masculine men say it's a good thing. Okay, so that's first. Going beyond the concept of masculinity, another important question is, how does masculinity actually impact our lives? So toward that, let's take a look at the relationship between masculinity and some important life outcomes. Okay, again, this is the result from a research called the US Adult Sexual Behaviors Attitudes, conducted in March 2021. Results from this survey show that men higher in feelings of masculinity report more stable and resourced life outcomes. So that includes higher income, education, healthier weight, greater religiosity, increased general happiness and life satisfaction. Okay. In the workplace, the same can be said. Roughly the same can be said. Okay. For example, researchers found that masculinity could signal employees' productivity assets, leadership ability, and success in the workplaces. Again, the emphasis here is signal. In other words, people somehow believe that possessing masculinity can lead to greater productivity, or masculinity is a sign of productivity, leadership ability, or success. So just to give you a few examples, when comparing the median salary between men and women, a 2021 report from PayScale reports that women earn 82% for every dollar men make. That's an 18% difference in the raw gender pay gap. Okay? And in terms of promotion, a recent study showed that on social sensing, in which male and female leaders were tagged with social metric badges that monitored everything they did and said for weeks. And this study showed that despite non-existing behavioral or performance differences between men and women, men were promoted to leadership roles much more frequently than women were. Okay? And the next finding is perhaps not, some of you might be familiar with it, which is in the business world, women who are aggressive, assertive, and confident get more promotions. So these are traditionally masculine traits. Okay, and women, if equipped with these traits, get more promotion opportunities, especially when they can turn these traits on and off depending on the social circumstances. That is, women who display masculine traits and know when not to get more promotions than men. So far, the news is pretty positive about masculinity. But just like every coin has two sides, the effect of masculinity on our lives is not always positive. Again, here are a few more examples. So in terms of life expectancy, as you can see here, the average for men is 81.6 in OECD countries and 80 for Canada. In contrast, the average for women is 87.3 for OECD countries and 84.1 for Canada. The difference in longevity between men and women is quite obvious. Now, when it comes to coronary disease, again, men consistently face a higher risk than women, especially after the age of 39. Now, this figure is about cardiovascular disease and non-cardiovascular disease. Now, while the figures may look different, the overall story remains the same. Men are more likely than women to develop both cardiovascular and non-cardiovascular diseases. So by now, we've seen both the pros and cons of masculinity on objective and subjective life outcomes, such as health, income, career, satisfaction, just to name a few. Now, as a behavioral scientist, my interest lies in the impact of masculinity on behaviors, which motivated my collaborators and to embark on a serious research that explore how masculinity shape our behaviors. So in the first research, we looked at the implications of masculinity for antisocial behaviors. Now, I'd like to preface this study by saying that we're certainly not the first one to investigate this topic. Now, before we started our research, there was a long line of research associating masculinity with behaviors such as aggression and deviance. And indeed, researchers found that, for example, higher masculinity is associated with men reporting more aggression, loving a good fight, and even taking advantage of others, as well as with other general assertiveness, like taking charge. Okay, as you can see, there are 3 bars shown in this figure, each correspond to a certain level of masculinity. Okay, as you can see across the board, as the level of masculinity increases, these traits become more salient. Okay, so take aggression, for example. Okay, the deep blue bar shows 30% versus the light blue bar shows 13%. And difference between these 2 bars is the deep blue bar represent people who report that they're very masculine, versus the light blue bars are the ones that report not as masculine. Okay, same can be said about take advantage of others. 51% of those who self-report as very masculine say that they are more like, they often engage in taking advantage of other people, compared to only 18% for those who don't report as masculine. Okay. Now, so since others have already looked at the relationship between masculinity and people's tendency for aggressive behaviors, what's new in our research? Well, what's new in our research is that we found in this particular research I'm presenting, we found a switch that turns these antisocial behavior tendencies on and off, and that switch is rooted in the fragility of masculinity. In other words, masculinity, because it's different from maleness, it's not born, and it actually has to be earned. It's actually quite fragile. And what we noticed in this research is that this turned out to be the switch that turns off the association between masculinity and people's aggressive tendencies. So this research starts with the observation that masculinity is highly sought after because traits associated with masculinity, such as assertiveness, achievement striving, align with values that are celebrated and desired in our society, both historically and today. And as we saw earlier in the presentation, masculinity is associated with a host of desirable outcomes. Further, besides being highly desirable, masculinity is also very fragile. Why is that? Now, researchers from different fields such as anthropology and psychology have argued across time and cultures that manhood or masculinity is relatively hard-earned and easily lost. There's a theory called precarious manhood theory, which argues just that. So historically, men willing to take significant risks to garner resources were selected desirable mates, and social standing has historically been conferred upon men willing to undertake dangerous physical labor and gamble with their safety for the sake of garnering resources. So indeed, it appears that at least socially, men are often viewed as made, not born. And in many cultures, progression through into manhood has often involved painful and even dangerous rites of passage. Furthermore, manhood remains a tenuous social role across lifespan. In other words, proving your manhood only for once is not enough. Okay, it requires continuous effort to maintain that. In studies asking participants to explain how an individual might lose their manhood, individuals are readily available to generate a long list of social shortcomings that would result in a gender forfeit or in a masculinity forfeit, such as losing a job or letting others down. So given in light of masculinity's desirability and fragility, it is perhaps not so surprising that men will be motivated to defend their masculinity when it's been compromised. So the question now becomes, how do men defend their masculinity? And we propose that much of that can be done through antisocial behaviors. Why? So antisocial behaviors such as aggression, by its very nature, is risky, which makes deviance or which makes such behaviors a suitable means for restoring social proof of masculinity. Taking risks has over time become associated with masculinity, and taking episodic risks represents a common strategy for restoring masculinity. Further, antisocial behavior should also provide men with proof of agency or autonomy following masculinity threat. Antisocial behaviors involve, for example, violating norms, which can demonstrate one's sort of unfettered ability to act without regard to constraints. For instance, one research found that employees often engage in misconduct as a function of psychological reactance. They seek to retaliate against the organization's constraint on them. Okay? So by the same token, we argue that masculinity threat should similarly motivate antisocial behaviors, as men who believe that they have been denied their masculinity at work should be motivated to both demonstrate autonomy and garner resources for themselves to restore their perceptions of masculinity. Okay. So we did that in a series of studies. In the first study, which is an experiment, we randomly assigned participants into two conditions. One is a masculinity threat. The other one is high masculinity threat. The other one is low masculinity threat. And then we looked at the effect. Then we looked at the tendency for men and women to engage in workplace deviance, which is a specific form of antisocial behavior in the workplace under these different conditions. As you can see here, the dotted line represents male participants. the solid line, and the solid line represents female participants. As you can see, the male participants were a lot more likely to engage in workplace deviance when they were assigned to the high masculinity threat condition. Okay, so that tells us that when compared with women, when men sense their sense of masculinity has been threatened, they are more likely to engage in workplace deviance or antisocial behavior. The reason behind that is, as I discussed earlier, is to restore a sense of agency, as well as the agency, as well as the sense of autonomy associated with their sense of masculinity. We were also able to replicate this finding in another experiment in which we assessed participant tendency to engage in yet a different antisocial behavior, deception, of following masculinity threat. As you can see here, among men, those who were in a threat condition were a lot more likely to engage in deception compared to other men in the neutral condition. With women, we see actually a reversal effect. Okay? Women in the neutral condition were slightly more likely to engage in deception than those in the threat condition. But I have to clarify that the difference between these two bars among women is not significant, meaning we cannot conclude that women were actually more likely to engage in deception following a threat to femininity. But the difference between the two bars among men was definitely significant. Okay, so that's our research about masculinity and our people's workplace behaviors. In a different study, we looked at how masculine norms influence our eating habits. So here's an anecdote for this research and where we got the idea for this research. So 2 weeks prior to President Obama's 2009 inauguration, President Bush hosted a lunch that brought together all 5 living current, former, and future presidents. Former White House chef Walter Sheep was asked about what he might serve these men with different tastes. And here's what he said. He said, "I think the key word here is men. There isn't blue state food and red state food. Food at the White House has a tendency to delineate along gender lines as opposed to political lines. Both first ladies that I worked with here were very much into nutrition. Both presidents that I worked with, if we had opened up a barbecue pit or a rib joint, they'd be just happy." So although former presidents and their families are, by no means representative of the population at large, the idea that food is gendered, that healthy and unhealthy eating can be associated with femininity and masculinity was quite intriguing to us. That's why we conducted research in which we investigated how cultural stereotypes about gender, such as masculinity, influence people's preferences. So again, we're not the first one to delve into this phenomenon. Research has found that men and women do in fact consume different types of food and express different desires with respect to dieting and healthy eating. Specifically, men are less concerned than women about eating healthy food. So for example, men report that they prefer more unhealthy foods such as red meat compared to women, while women report preferring more healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables compared to men. And furthermore, men are more likely than women to consume diet or low-calorie food. Now, given the strong behavioral associations between gender and food preferences, a question that intrigued us is whether similar association has been developed in people's psyche about gender and food. That is, have people developed psychological associations linking healthy or light food such as salad, chicken, and yogurt with femininity, and unhealthy or heavy food like beef, potatoes, and beer with masculinity as a result of the repeated exposure to different food preferences among men and women. So we tested this hypothesis by subtly activating the concepts of masculinity and femininity, and then examined whether people eat more in line with prevailing gender stereotypes as a result. That is, we activated the concept of masculinity or femininity, and we looked at whether, people in different conditions actually show different preferences for healthy and unhealthy food. This research was titled Macho Nachos, the Implicit Effects of Gender Food Packaging on Preferences for Healthy and Unhealthy Food, and it was published in a journal called Social Psychology. So this is what we did in this study. Again, it was an experiment. What we did is we randomly assigned participants into two conditions. In the masculinity condition, in both conditions, participants were asked to engage in a scrambled sentence task in which they were given different words and were asked to assemble these words into a coherent sentence. In the masculinity condition, participants were given quite a list of words. Among these words, we have words that have been shown to be associated with masculinity. These words are football, boys, blue, cologne, mustache, men, and hunting. In the femininity condition, the stimuli words include ballet, girls, pink, perfume, lipstick, women, and shopping. Okay, we didn't pick these words just for no reason. We actually had, prior to this study, we had a pretest of different words and asked participants to rank the extent to which these words, the extent to which the words are in terms of masculinity or femininity. These words came out to be as highly ranked by our participant. That's why we picked them to use as a stimuli in the study. So after we activated masculinity or femininity, participants were asked again to choose between two versions of basically the same food. Okay, they were asked to evaluate this food on several dimensions. So the food that participants were asked to evaluate include, so basically they show up in pairs: baked chicken or fried chicken. They were asked to choose between these two, and then they were also asked to evaluate each option. The second pair is baked potato and French fries. The third pair is light potato chips or reduced fat potato chips versus regular potato chips. And the last one is baked fish versus fried fish. Here's what we here are the results. First, this is the figure looking at the effect of actual gender on participant preference for unhealthy food. Okay, not surprisingly, male participant reported a much stronger preference for the unhealthy version of the same food than female participants. Okay, that's exactly what we've expected. But the more interesting part is, whether activation of different gender stereotypes make people prefer one kind of food over the other. That is, regardless of their actual gender, does the idea of masculinity or femininity make people more likely to prefer a particular type of food? And this is what we found. Okay, those who were in the masculinity, my apology, there's a typo here. It should be MAS. This is what we found. Those participants in the masculinity condition were much more likely to choose the unhealthy version of the same food than their counterparts in the femininity condition. And this is regardless of their actual gender. That means those who choose the unhealthy version of the same food could also be a female participant. And the reason why they chose this particular food is because the idea of masculinity was activated in their mind at that moment. Okay? And we also asked participants, the extent to which they will be eating more healthfully in the future. Those who are in the masculinity condition were a lot less likely to do so than those in the femininity condition. Okay. And for those of you who are really interested in sort of the interactive effect between gender and gender norms on preference for unhealthy food, this is what we found. This sort of confirms my earlier statement that gender doesn't seem to matter as much when the idea of masculinity is activated in people's mind. As you can see, among both men and women, in both conditions, the masculinity condition and the femininity condition, and among both gender, men and women, those those in the masculinity condition were much more likely to prefer the unhealthy version of the same food than those in the femininity condition. So this is quite interesting because it provides a very powerful evidence for our hypothesis that gender may be contributing to people's eating preference, food preferences, but the concept of masculinity or femininity can also contribute in a unique way to our food preferences. That means even for women, if the idea of masculinity is very strong, their food preference will still be influenced by that. Okay. So due to time constraint, we also conducted a few other studies related to this, but due to time constraint, I won't be able to go through all of them. But here's my last slide on the takeaway based on my reflection on the research I've done on this topic. So as you can see, masculinity, it's like I said earlier, it's not all good or bad. But what we see now these days, especially in the workplace, is the notion of toxic masculinity, meaning we see a lot more we see masculinity doing a lot more damage than good in the workplace. And what should we do about that? Okay. So here are a few suggestions that my co-authors and I wrote in our recent HBR case about how we can sort of leverage masculinity for the well-being for everyone, not just some men. So what the basic stance is that we will all benefit from broadening our definitions of masculinity. Okay, so the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what if we idolize good men instead of real men? Manhood or masculinity doesn't have just to be about traits such as aggression and strength. It can also include qualities such as civility, fairness, gentleness, and being nurturing and collaborative. Okay, so toward that end, we propose this idea of healthy masculinity, which is a way of being masculine that is positive, affirming, and respectful of others, and also to oneself. It's a way of expressing and embodying masculine traits and values in a way that promotes well-being and positive relations for everyone. Okay? And that includes the following components: empathy, emotional intelligence, respectful communication, responsibility, collaboration, and self-care. Okay. So I just got the prompt that how are we doing on time, Rose?
I think it'll be a great time to open up for some questions if you're ready to.
All right. I think that's all I have. I'll be happy to chat with the audience about any questions they may have.
That's great. So we now have some time for questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions. And if you're watching live on Facebook, you're also welcome to submit questions or comments through the comments section for video as well. And so actually, I want to start with a question that I found. First of all, your presentation was really interesting and fascinating. I thought that was so interesting. And so a question that has come up is, these antisocial behaviors in the first part of your research you talked about that kind of men will end up kind of portraying because a threat to their masculinity. And so how would you say in the workplace those behaviors are combated? Like, does it usually take another masculine figure to kind of combat those kind of behaviors, or what would you say are like strategies or like in the workplace that would be employed to kind of, deal with that?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Actually, it leads to another stream of research, which is about dark side of workplace behaviors. In terms of how we should, how people. First of all, I'll take two steps to answer your question, Rose. The first one is, how do people usually combat antisocial behaviors? So that takes a few forms. Sometimes, it's called the vigilante justice perspective. Like you said, someone else would take it up on their own hands and try to fix it. That's one. And sometimes the supervisor would. This is a time when organizational policies will come into play, where for organizations where there's is a functional policy, like civil workplace policy in place. This is when things will be taken care of in a rather procedure manner. We'll look at our policy and see how things should be addressed when antisocial behaviors emerge in the workplace. Now that's how people and quite obviously before it gets picked up by someone else or by the supervisor, very often the victim would try to take care of it on his or her own. Okay, now that's what people usually do, either by taking care of it themselves or someone else intervene or the boss intervene. Research is also showing that how we should be dealing with this. Now, for those who who try to resolve it on their own, or have a third party intervene, what we see again is that that'll trigger what we call a downward spiral, where either you solicit further retaliation from those who start the antisocial behavior, or this particular conflict will involve a third party if the third party is the one who took it up on their own hands to fix. Mm-hmm. So far the research has shown that it takes a village to minimize the damage of antisocial behaviors. So that means not only individual employees have to be aware of the importance of civility at work, the organization also has to have appropriate policies in place to prevent that from happening, and also to provide procedures for such behaviors to be resolved rather fairly when they emerge. So it takes individuals as well as the organization, both parties, to minimize the impact of antisocial behaviors.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna kind of sandwich a couple of questions together here, one from the Q&A
Sure.
with another one. So this gender threat, as we've learned, threatens and causes negative behaviors among men. So I have a two-part question to come on off that. Why don't we see similar outcomes with women, right? Because there can be masculine women as well. And as another part of that, what part has race kind of played in this, like how it affects masculinity as well? Do you see different variants in that as well? So I'm kind of going to sandwich that into two questions.
Great question. Thank you, Rose. So first of all, why doesn't it affect women? So if I can go back to one of my earlier slides, as you can see, the effect is rather minimal for women. And the idea again is rooted in this idea of, is in the concept of identity. It's more frequent, or it's more obvious for men, because for many men, especially in the North American context, that has to do with the next question. In North American context is that men tend to have a masculine identity. That identity tells men that this is how you should behave. And if you don't, then, your sense of, manhood, your sense of gender identity is threatened. Now, with women, such identity is actually has a very different connotation, has a very different content. Women, at least from a social perspective, are more communal. So being masculine, a lot of these traits that we see men embrace simply aren't as appealing to women. For women, it's cooperation, it's nurturing that matters more to their identity. So when their gender identity is threatened, men and women have very different ways of reaffirming their gender identity. For men, it's, what can I do to show that I'm a real man, by perhaps doing things that demonstrate to the world your strength, for example. For women, the result will be very much communal or cooperative or very nurturing. Now, I think you asked a really good follow-up question about, masculine women. Then for that question, for that question, we're going to have to dig a little deeper and ask, is it because, so for women who act in a masculine way, there are a couple of reasons why people would do that. One is for instrumental reasons. I mentioned earlier that in workplace, research has found that in workplaces where, where women can demonstrate some masculine traits, actually get more promotions. So in that case, if if their masculinity is threatened, it probably doesn't matter as much, because it was rather, the reason why they embrace these masculine traits are rather instrumental. Now, for women who actually identify with masculine traits, then I would guess the finding that I reported here will also emerge. Mm-hmm. So basically, these findings are based on sort of, a general pattern of the population. It won't, by presenting these findings don't suggest that every man or every woman will follow this pattern. We will have people who simply just do not follow this pattern, and that is totally expected. Mm-hmm. Now, that leads me to the second question, which is, the impact of race on the finding here. I have to say that the finding that I'm presenting here is based on several samples, both from the Western cultures as well as Eastern cultures. We have one sample from China and several samples from US and Canada. And the finding in general look similar across different cultures. Now, one sample we do not have is from some of the North Scandinavian countries where masculinity and femininity aren't as unequal as in other parts of the world. Okay, so in places like this, again, I cannot say for sure what will happen because I don't have a sample from that particular culture. But from these cultures, what I can say, well, what I want to speculate on is that perhaps gender threat may not matter as much, or masculinity threat may not matter as much, because the reason why people react so strongly, especially men, react so strongly to masculinity threat in the North American context, sometimes even in Chinese context, is because in these cultures, masculinity has a lot to do with some important outcomes, such as their income, their career advancement, and their status. Yeah. Okay. So a threat to masculinity is not just a threat to your identity. In these cultures, a threat to identity may also be bad news for some material outcomes. That's why people work really hard to try to defend their masculinity. Now, in other cultures where masculinity is not, is not associated with so many important outcomes, perhaps it won't trigger, it won't trigger reactions as intensive as what we see here. So, to answer the second question, how does race affect masculinity threat? I would say great question. And it really depends on that particular cultural background associated with that race. If the culture doesn't put too much, if a particular culture doesn't put too much value, or too much material value on masculinity, it probably won't result in very strong reactions. Not saying I'm not saying people won't react at all, because an identity is an identity. People still value it very much. But without this added sort of component of material outcome, I would say the severity of the reactions will be will be much weaker.
So I think you kind of fed into the next question that was on the chat here. We're asking about Canadian life expectancy is lower than average, and feeding into some of those differences, like you said, across. But we have time for one final question, and I'm going to go into a Facebook question. So
Sure.
would you say that, you talked about manhood moving towards more positive kind of descriptors and views, and would you say that as now time is moving on, like as the generations change, that there's a lot more potential, because we can think about, the way my father was and the way my brothers are and the way my son are going to be very different versions of maleness, and so would you say that there's a potential now as time goes on for some of these things to kind of change, like in a positive way, that is healthy masculinity?
I think it all starts with awareness. We're certainly not the only team who's found this finding. Like in writing up these manuscripts, we read a ton of other papers who found similar patterns, where people. I think this wave of research on masculinity or masculine norms on our behavior will certainly start the movement toward a more, I would say, a more functional version of masculinity. By functional, I mean, we saw the numbers. Men have lower life expectancy, and also men have a higher risk of contracting coronary diseases or cardiovascular disease, or even non-cardiovascular diseases. So it's simply not functional. And a lot of that can be traced back to how we see ourselves as men, or as how we sort of raise our children, especially boys, and how men take care of themselves. Okay, so it's a perfect time. It's perfect time that we start thinking about these issues. Okay, these are just some of the suggestions that my collaborators and I put forward, for people to think about. Obviously, I'm sure there are a lot more to be added to the list about how we should most optimally conceptualize this identity of masculinity. But at the same time, I don't want us to just forget about all the benefits that are stereotypically or that are traditionally associated with masculinity. Okay, not everything, because what we've noticed in our research is that there is a lot of discussion about toxicity in masculinity. So much so that we sometimes lose sight that this is rather neutral term. It does have its benefits. So when we are when we are working on a better version of masculinity, let's not just discard the whole idea and forget about it. There are things that we can keep as we move forward to a more healthy version.
I love that, definitely, and I definitely agree with that as a woman, and really appreciate that. So our time is up, but this has been such a great conversation. Professor Zhu, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's a pleasure to have you here and representing the Schiller School of Business and in your work. Thank you again, and you're welcome to now turn off your video, and take care. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks, everyone.
For those of you who'd like to share today's session with family and friends, it will be posted to our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. You can also watch past lectures you may have missed. We have one more poll question for you. How would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? Should pop up on your screen right now. Join us for our next Scholars Hub at Home session, BEEC, the York Bee Collection, globally recognized research at York University, a partnership with the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Register for that event and learn more about upcoming sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you and be well.